I'm Dan Ruby. I'm a science educator from Southern Oregon, and I am running for U.S. House of Representatives in our very large congressional district. I want to tell you a little bit about who I am and how I got here. I started my career teaching kids about space, elementary school kids, and that moved into working with high school kids through career and technical education, helping them plug into where they thrive, which is either university or two-year college or apprenticeships. And then I got recruited to be the CEO of a science museum, and we got funding to do a national exhibit on climate change. And how we experience that in Oregon is through our waters and our forests. And one of the components of that is wildfires that are increasingly severe. And in September of 2020, that became very real for me when the Alameda fire started in Ashland and swept through Talent and Phoenix and destroyed 2,500 homes overnight. At that point, just talking about something didn't feel like enough to me anymore. I had to do something. And so I shifted my career into working for a fire rebuilding nonprofit, and that turned into working for a federally qualified health center on transitional housing with Health and Human Services for fire survivors. And I learned a couple things from that. One is that half the households in our district are struggling. Our families are employed, they're working hard, but they're not able to make ends meet. They're spending more than a third of their income on housing. They're spending 20% of their income on medical bills. They have no savings. They are one unforeseen circumstance away from serious trouble. That can be a kid getting sick, that can be a car breaking down, or that can be an extreme weather event. Related to that, we have some of the worst mental health in the nation. And for youth, we're dead last. That's depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, and substance use. We can do better. That became very real for me in 2022 when one of my very close friends lost their oldest son to an overdose just a few days shy of his 21st birthday. I don't want that to happen to anybody else's kid. What I did about that was run for school board, because the way to prevent that is to care for kids upstream before that becomes a problem. But you can't just care for students. You have to also care for their families if you want to be effective. And if you really want to do a good job, you can't just care for families, you have to care for the communities they're in. So all of a sudden you're looking at what does it take to build strong, resilient, vibrant communities, and the top of that list are homes we can afford, better access to mental health care, and education opportunities for our students and for our workers, for our next generation industries. That's my experience, and those are the priorities that I would bring to Congress. I would work very, very, very hard to originate policies and programs to help Oregonians here at home, and thank you. So the issue that I would like to face most would be addressing housing. It's a huge issue nationally, and what that looks like for rural Oregon is much different than what it looks like for Portland or for anywhere else in the country. What I actually expect the issue that I would be addressing is divisiveness in politics. Regardless of how the presidential election turns out, we are going to be a divided nation. And we don't get anything done in rural Oregon if you don't work with your neighbor at the end of who has a different sign at the end of their driveway. So I think repairing that and remembering that we have shared values, we have a shared vision for safe, prosperous communities. We have different ideas of how to get there, but that we are not going to get anything. The past 4 years, we've seen very little done because folks like to vote against the other party. That's not the way we're going to move forward. So I would say that it would be a super effort of mine to work with folks, regardless of their political party, to make sure that we address the issues that are facing us.
The question is for Mike and Dan, and it's an observation that we have some drought conditions, and what do they suggest we do or what will they do to manage it?
Thank you for the question. Yes, my district is 70,000 square miles, the side of the state of Washington, and water is a huge issue. But it looks different for each part of the district. So it's different for Southern Oregon, different for Central Oregon, different for Eastern Oregon. What I've seen work is in places like in the Klamath Basin, we had everybody at the table. We had ranchers, we had tribal members, we had environmentalists, we had every water user at the table for many years, coming to an agreement that was imperfect but workable. These things are complex and messy. What happened was that my opponent came in with federal legislation that I don't think will pass, but basically tanks it. It's coming in and thinking that the federal government knows better than what folks know for their own region. And so instead of supporting the work that had been done, it was stepping on the toes of the folks that have been working. And so a lot of that's going to be starting from scratch. I guess to answer your question, we're going to have less water in the future. Everybody's going to have less water. Even the senior users are going to have less water. So we're going to have to change how we do things. But those ideas need to come from the communities that are on those waterways, and everybody needs to be at the table. And we need to have minimal interference from the federal government, except for to support us in those agreements. It's a big question, and I want to focus on fires. We're up to nearly 2 million acre mega fires. That doesn't work for anybody. That doesn't work for loggers. It doesn't work for ranchers that have their livestock on our lands. It doesn't work for farmers. It doesn't work for people that live in and around communities that are burning. I agree with folks across the political spectrum that our science in how we manage forest lands is out of date. We can do better with managing our public lands. We can do things like burn underbrush. We can do much better about how we replant. We can do better about thinning and how we log. We can also provide incentives for private landowners to do better and use updated science. But that's only part of the thing. We are not going to get better on wildfire if we don't also acknowledge that climate change is happening. We need to address and mitigate that. And we can't, unfortunately, do that without reducing fossil fuels. I also recognize that we're in a unique position in rural Oregon. So I'm on the Rural School Board Caucus. We don't want electric buses. You can't have electric buses in rural Oregon. It doesn't work. The routes, they would run out of batteries halfway through their route. You also, the Ford Family Foundation put out a Oregon by the numbers. You know how much people drive in Malheur County? On average, per person, per year, 96,000 miles. You can't do that in an electric car, and we don't have the infrastructure. We're not going to put that in rural Oregon. We will always depend on fossil fuels. We will always need gas vehicles in rural Oregon. Thank you. So I think that we just can't get around things like large solar. So when we talk batteries, we aren't necessarily talking the kind of batteries that you think of, but scaled up. There's such thing as water batteries. You can have water that's pumped up during the day and then flows down to turn turbines at night when solar's not working. So we're looking at forward-thinking, next-generation stuff. So wind, solar, and water are going to be the ways that we get there, and it's going to look different for each community. I would really love to see a move toward more municipal scale and more public-owned community scale stuff that fits each community. And then there are some county commissioners in Umatilla that are really fascinated with called small module reactors, so next generation nuclear. What I have to say, it doesn't exist yet. It does not exist yet. When people talk about nuclear, we're talking about nuclear that's decades old. I'm not interested in that, but that's not to say that in the future there won't be smarter, better, smaller, cleaner, safer nuclear power. So I think a mix of those things. I want to compare how I've spent the past 4 years versus how my opponent has spent the past 4 years. I've spent the past 4 years working on housing, health, and education in my community with people regardless of their political party. My opponent has spent the past 4 years voting against programs and projects that benefit Oregonians alongside his seatmate Marjorie Taylor Greene. I have nothing against him personally. I think he's a wonderful person. But he's had one piece of legislation come out of committee and none become laws. I have 40 pieces of legislation ready to pick up and take to the finish line. I believe the job of our representative is to work hard for the folks in our district, and I pledge to do that.